Black Janitor asked to leave Millionaire's Gala until he starts playing the piano. The marble floors shimmered under the glittering chandeliers, polished so meticulously that every reflection danced like liquid gold. The air was perfumed with wealth, notes of aged cologne, designer floral arrangements, and the faint crispness of champagne bubbling in crystal flutes. Inside the Crescent Pavilion, a modern architectural marvel perched high above the city, the annual Langston Foundation Gala was in full motion. A swirling blend of tuxedos, gowns, and sharp laughter from the mouths of people who never had to worry about rent or bus fare. In the far back corner, near the service entrance, where the real light didn't quite reach and where no one looked twice unless they had a complaint, stood Elijah. Elijah Cole had worked for the Langston building for nearly 8 years, first as a night cleaner, then as a facilities assistant, and now simply as the janitor. He was 56, tall and broad-shouldered despite the weight of time bending his spine. His uniform was neatly pressed, his salt and pepper hair hidden beneath a navy cap, and his hands, those large, calloused hands, carried the quiet dignity of a man who had worked hard his entire life. And tonight he had made a mistake. Not a big one, not in the grand scheme of the universe, but in this room it was enough. He had walked through the wrong door. He had stepped into the main ballroom of the gala. It had been accidental. He'd come looking for the custodian's closet to fetch a broken mop. But when he pushed the heavy door open, the warm hum of violins washed over him, and his boots echoed against the marble floor. Dozens of heads had turned. Some smiled uncertainly, thinking perhaps he was part of the staff refilling glasses. But others narrowed their eyes. He didn't belong. It was in the way he stood, the way he moved, the uniform. "Elijah?" A voice barked behind him. He turned slowly to see Mr. Peterson, event director, tall, lean, with the kind of forced smile that never quite reached his eyes, striding toward him with quick, decisive steps. "What are you doing in here?" Peterson asked, voice low but firm. "I was just looking for the supply closet, sir," Elijah said, taking a small step back, hat in hand, shoulders slightly bowed. "Didn't mean to interrupt." Peterson nodded tightly, then leaned in closer, lowering his voice to a whisper laced with warning. "This is not your area tonight. You understand me? This is the Foundation Gala. We've got donors from across the country, board members, press. I need the guests focused on the music, not wondering why the janitor's walking through the ballroom." Elijah gave a slow nod. "Yes, sir. Wasn't trying to cause trouble." "Good. Then stay in the maintenance halls where you're supposed to be. We can't afford any distractions." Peterson turned with the sharpness of a man used to being obeyed, and Elijah, still holding his cap, slipped back through the door, quietly like a shadow. But before it shut, his eyes had wandered across the room to something unexpected. At the edge of the ballroom floor sat a Steinway grand piano, black, gleaming, untouched, the kind of instrument that lived on magazine covers, in concert halls, in homes where music wasn't just appreciated, it was inherited. Elijah had known pianos once, a long time ago. He returned to the lower corridors without a word, though something in him stirred, something like the soft ache of memory pressing gently against his ribs. In a quieter part of the building, 2 servers leaned against a counter near the catering prep area, their bow ties slightly loosened, their name tags glinting in the cold LED light. "You see that Peterson guy snap at Elijah?" one said, voice low but curious. The other nodded. "He always acts like that when rich folks are around. Elijah just walked through by mistake. I heard he used to play piano back in the day." "No way." "Swear. My cousin said he was some kind of prodigy, used to play in churches and clubs before life hit him hard." Lost his mom, dropped out of school, had to take care of his siblings or something. Man, ain't that always how it goes? They both went quiet, listening to the echo of distant laughter from above. Back in the janitor's closet, Elijah sat on an overturned crate, sipping coffee from a thermos older than half the people upstairs. His fingers, still strong despite the wear, curled and uncurled slowly, unconsciously, like they were searching for keys that weren't there. He hadn't touched a piano in 12 years. He hadn't played in public in nearly 20. But music was funny like that. It didn't leave you. Not really. It just waited quietly, patiently, until you remembered who you were. And tonight, something about that Steinway, shining under the Gala lights, sitting untouched like a throne in the middle of people who used music as ambience. Something about it made him remember. He rose slowly, the familiar creak in his knees sounding like old wood floors. He didn't know what he was doing, not exactly, but he found himself walking carefully, deliberately, back toward the ballroom. The corridors were quieter now. Most of the guests had gathered on the other side for speeches and champagne. He moved unnoticed, invisible as ever. When he slipped inside the edge of the room again, no one noticed, except for one person, a girl, maybe 10 or 11, sat alone at a table, kicking her heels against the chair. Her parents were laughing nearby with another couple, too engaged to notice her boredom. She saw Elijah and tilted her head. "Are you a musician?" He blinked. "No, ma'am. Just a janitor." "You look like a musician," she said. "My teacher says musicians get quiet eyes." He smiled faintly. "Well, maybe once, a long time ago." The little girl pointed to the Steinway. "You can play it if you want. No one's using it." He hesitated. And then, as if carried not by courage but by memory itself, he stepped toward the piano. The bench creaked beneath him as he sat. His hands hovered over the keys. The room buzzed distantly with champagne chatter and clinking glass. And then, he played. Just a few notes at first. Simple, bare. Then a chord. Then a progression. Then a melody. Familiar, haunting, graceful. Something between a church hymn and a jazz improvisation. It rose like smoke from his fingers, slow and unsure at first, then blooming into something rich, warm, unmistakable. And suddenly, silence. The chatter died down. The laughter paused. One by one, heads turned toward the man at the Steinway. And no one saw a janitor anymore. For a moment, it was as if time itself had forgotten to move forward. The room, previously alive with the hum of idle conversation, the gentle swishing of satin dresses, and the precise clinking of utensils against porcelain, was suddenly suspended in reverent silence. The sounds that had filled it now emerged only from Elijah's hands, as they coaxed a tender, aching melody from the piano that neither demanded attention nor asked permission, but still took it. The notes weren't flashy or loud. They weren't meant to impress. They flowed like memory itself, the way a river doesn't announce its arrival. It simply carves through whatever stands in its path. Some of the guests turned slowly in their chairs. Others froze mid-sip or mid-laugh, their expressions softening as the music washed over them like rain on stone. At the far end of the room, Peterson returned, walking briskly from the corridor where he'd been managing the wine delivery. He froze halfway across the floor, confusion flashing across his face as he saw the source of the music. "No, no, no, no," he muttered, breath quickening. It was Elijah, in uniform, at the grand piano. Peterson's nostrils flared. He turned on his heel and stormed toward the piano. But he wasn't fast enough, because before he could reach him, the music shifted. Elijah's fingers lifted into a more intricate arrangement. still delicate, still restrained, but with a richness that no background pianist could fake. A jazz motif emerged, lightly brushed with classical phrasing, then a subtle gospel chord progression hidden like a signature between the keys. It was intentional, alive, and people noticed, not just the guests but the right guests. At a nearby table, a tall man in a navy velvet tuxedo leaned forward slowly. His name was Leonard Kessington, a retired music producer who had worked with orchestras and jazz musicians before building his empire of media ventures and real estate. He wasn't easily impressed, but now his eyebrows rose. Who hired him? He asked no one in particular, his tone somewhere between curiosity and disbelief. A woman at his table, a gallery owner from Soho, whispered, "I don't think he was hired. That's the janitor, isn't it?" Kessington didn't respond. His eyes never left the piano. By now, Elijah was gone. Not physically, but emotionally. His shoulders had softened. His chin tilted slightly downward. The crease in his brow no longer stress but concentration. His body moved not with effort but instinct. He was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere with his mother's voice humming behind him in the kitchen, with Sunday sunlight spilling through stained glass, with his brother tapping rhythms on the kitchen table as kids. Somewhere before all this. Somewhere before the years that had bent his back and quieted his voice. The little girl from earlier, still seated at her table, watched with rapt awe. She hadn't moved once, even as her parents noticed her silence and turned to see what held her attention, even as dozens of others stood or slowly approached the piano. Peterson, now almost to the keys, cleared his throat sharply. "Elijah," he said through clenched teeth, trying to keep his voice low. "What are you doing?" Elijah didn't respond. His hands kept moving. "Elijah," Peterson hissed, stepping closer. "This is completely unacceptable. You are not." "Let him finish," came a voice. Peterson turned. It was Leonard Kessington. "I'm sorry." Peterson blinked, surprised by the interruption. "I said, let him finish," Kessington repeated, this time louder. His tone wasn't angry, it was absolute. Peterson opened his mouth, then shut it again. More guests were gathering now, forming a semicircle around the piano as if drawn by gravity. Some had tears in their eyes and didn't understand why. Others simply stood, mesmerized, unsure what they were feeling, but feeling all the same. Elijah transitioned into a final refrain, simple, familiar, a lullaby his mother once hummed while braiding his sister's hair. It lingered in the air like a prayer, and when the last note fell, there was no rush of applause, only stillness, reverence. Then, after a moment, one person clapped, then another, then a wave. The applause grew, not polite, not performative, but full, standing ovation applause. Some people even whistled. Some were still wiping at their eyes. And Elijah, he simply stood. He didn't bow, didn't smile. He just looked around the room, face calm, breath steady, and began to walk back toward the corridor from which he came. But before he could vanish again, Kessington stepped into his path. "Excuse me," the man said, holding out his hand. "That was incredible. I'm Leonard Kessington." Elijah paused. Slowly, he shook the man's hand. "Elijah Cole." "You're not a janitor," Kessington said softly. Elijah offered a tired smile. "Tonight I am." Kessington leaned in. "You ever think about playing again? For real?" Elijah's eyes searched the man's, not with hope, but with skepticism carved by years of being seen too late. "I used to," he replied. "A long time ago." Kessington nodded. "Well, maybe it's time someone heard you again." and behind them the gala was changed, not because a millionaire had spoken, but because a janitor had. With music. By morning, the story had already begun to move beyond the ballroom. It started as a whisper on social media, a post from one of the guests, a blurry 30-second video showing a tall black man in a janitor's uniform playing the piano with astonishing grace, surrounded by well-dressed attendees in stunned silence. The caption read simply, "The janitor at the Langston Gala just silenced the room with this." No words. From there, it exploded. Within 12 hours, the clip had been reposted across platforms, drawing hundreds of thousands of views and tens of thousands of comments. People asked who he was. Others speculated. A few claimed to know him from back in the day. Hashtags began to form. Hashtag janitor virtuoso. Hashtag play it Elijah. Hashtag invisible no more. Elijah, meanwhile, didn't know any of this. He had left the gala quietly after the crowd had thinned, changing out of his uniform before the last of the catering staff had finished boxing leftovers. He had taken the bus home, as always, window seat, eyes unfocused, fingers still unconsciously moving as though playing invisible keys on his knees. When he stepped into his small apartment on the west side, clean but old, with aging carpet and the persistent hum of the refrigerator as the only background sound, he didn't turn on the TV or check his phone. He simply sat down at the small table near the window, poured himself a glass of water, and stared at the skyline that glowed faintly in the distance. The music was still in him. It always had been. But now, something else stirred beneath it. The hum of being seen, and not because of a job title or a uniform, but because of a truth he thought he had buried years ago. By noon the next day, his supervisor at the Langston building, Mrs. Holloway, a sharp, good-hearted woman in her 60s who knew everyone's name and didn't tolerate rudeness from executives or interns, called him. "Elijah," she said, voice already thick with emotion. "You need to come in." He blinked. "Something wrong." "Not wrong," she said. "Just strange. Good strange, maybe. Just come." He arrived to find a camera crew waiting in the lobby. Apparently, a local arts reporter had gotten wind of the clip, and someone at the Langston Foundation, embarrassed by the PR optics of a janitor being publicly shushed, only to steal the show, was now trying to pivot the narrative. They had issued a statement praising the extraordinary hidden talent of a beloved member of our staff. Elijah stood quietly as a PR rep asked if he'd be willing to sit for a brief interview. Just a few questions, nothing invasive. They offered him a crisp new shirt, coffee, and gratitude for his grace under pressure. He declined the shirt. He sat on the worn leather bench in the break room, still in his janitor uniform, sipping from his thermos. The reporter was young, earnest, with thick glasses and a notepad that he clutched as though afraid it might vanish. "Elijah, when did you first learn to play?" He took a long breath before answering. "My mama taught me when I was 5, he said, his voice smooth, soft. "Old upright piano in our church basement. Keys were sticky. Some didn't play right, but she said if you could find the music around the broken notes, you'd always be able to play in any room." The reporter smiled. "And did you always want to be a professional musician?" "I was supposed to be," Elijah said slowly. "Had a scholarship lined up. But life, it has its own tempo. My mom got sick. My brother got into trouble. I had to step in. Took a job cleaning floors. 1 month turned into 1 year. 1 year turned into 2 decades. And you just stopped playing?" He looked down at his hands. "I didn't stop. I just stopped sharing it. There's a difference." The interview ended shortly after, but by evening it had aired, and the floodgates opened. He received voicemails from news outlets, messages from strangers who claimed they cried listening to him, and even a few emails from people he hadn't heard from in years. But not all attention was welcome. Peterson called the next day, tense, nervous. "Elijah, we need to talk," he said quickly. "About what?" "There's some buzz online. Some of the board members saw the video. A few of them think it reflects poorly on the foundation that someone as gifted as you has been cleaning bathrooms." "I've been cleaning bathrooms because it's honest work," Elijah replied calmly. "You never asked what else I could do." "I understand," Peterson said hastily. "And I'm not saying you were wrong, I'm just, look, this is delicate. There's pressure now. Some people want to turn this into a positive story for the gala. They're talking about maybe inviting you to perform officially at next year's event. Like scheduled, in uniform, sort of as a feature." Elijah blinked. "You mean, keep me as the janitor, but let me play once a year when the donors are watching?" There was silence on the line. "We're just trying to shape the message," Peterson finally muttered. "Make sure people don't misunderstand the roles." Elijah chuckled, a low, weary sound. "I think folks already understand more than you realize." He ended the call without another word. That evening, Elijah walked down to the local community center, a place he hadn't visited in over a decade. Inside was an old piano, tucked into a corner under a plastic tarp, dusty and out of tune. He asked the receptionist if he could use it. She looked up. "Wait, are you the guy from that video? The janitor pianist?" He smiled faintly. "Elijah Cole. I saw that clip. You made me cry," she said, handing him the key to the practice room. "Play as long as you want." He sat down, removed the tarp, and cracked his knuckles. The keys were stiff but real, familiar. He let his fingers find them again. Not for an audience, not for social media, not even for redemption, but for himself. And as the first note rang out, warm and slow and full of weight, the door cracked open. It was a little girl, curly-haired, same age as the one from the gala. Her mom stood behind her, watching nervously. "Is it okay if she listens?" the mother asked. Elijah nodded. "Course it is." The girl sat on the floor cross-legged, eyes wide, and he played. Not because he had to, because he could. The invitation arrived not by email, not through an assistant, and not even by phone call. It came in a thick envelope, ivory white, real paper, his name handwritten in elegant calligraphy. Mr. Elijah Cole. He opened it slowly at his kitchen table, beneath the flickering kitchen light that always hummed louder in the evenings. Inside was a letter from the Langston Conservatory of Music, one of the most prestigious institutions on the East Coast. He had once walked past it in his youth, pressing his face against its tall windows, listening to Bach and Brubeck bleeding through heavy doors like voices from a world that didn't know his name. "Dear Mr. Cole, after witnessing your performance at the Langston Gala, we were deeply moved by your artistry and presence. We would be honored to invite you to perform a solo piano set at our upcoming winter showcase, a night dedicated to musical brilliance that defies convention and inspires transformation. This is not a publicity request. We simply believe in recognizing greatness. Respectfully, Dr. Miriam Ellison, Artistic Director." He read it twice, then again. Elijah folded the letter carefully, smoothing the creases. He didn't smile, not because he wasn't moved, but because the weight of such moments, for people like him, was never without its shadow. He picked up his phone. The name that glowed on his contact list was one he hadn't dialed in a long time. Darnell Cole, his younger brother, the one he had raised, the one who had once dreamed of being a painter but had wound up laying drywall and raising two boys of his own. The one Elijah had sacrificed everything for without ever asking for anything in return. He pressed the call. It rang. Once. Twice. "Yo," came the voice on the other end, tired but familiar. "It's me." There was a pause. "Elijah." "Yeah. Been a while." "Yeah. You okay?" Elijah hesitated. "I got invited to play at the Langston Conservatory next month. Full solo set. Audience of critics, donors, maybe even labels." "Wait, what?" Darnell's voice sharpened. "You're serious?" "I'm serious." "Man, that's huge." Another pause. "So why do you sound like you just got sentenced to jury duty?" Elijah exhaled through his nose, leaned back in the creaky kitchen chair. "Because I don't know if it's mine, or if it's just them trying to write a story around me. They didn't see me before, not when I was sweeping their steps. But now, suddenly, I matter? And they want me to dress up and smile like they always believed in me." "They didn't," Darnell said. "But that don't mean you don't deserve to be there." Elijah looked down at his hands. The skin had hardened, but the music in them, it was still soft. "What if I get on that stage," he said slowly, "and all they see is a janitor in a borrowed suit?" "Then," Darnell replied, "you play in that borrowed suit so good, they forget what you wore. And if they don't, if they still see the uniform, that's their blindness, not yours." There was a long, quiet beat. "You raised me, Eli. Taught me what it means to stand tall even when the world tries to keep your shoulders bent. This ain't about proving them wrong. It's about reminding yourself what's always been true." Elijah blinked hard. "Thank you," he said, voice nearly cracking. "I'll be there," Darnell added. "Front row. And I'll bring the boys. They need to see this." The week that followed moved like a dream, moving just slow enough to feel real. A local boutique offered to tailor him a suit, free of charge, when they heard his name. A former student from his old church brought him a pair of shoes polished to a mirror shine. The community center let him use their piano after hours every evening. And every night he'd sit at that bench, long after the lights had dimmed, finding not just the notes, but his voice again. Meanwhile, Peterson, who had gone eerily quiet since the gala, called him once more. "Elijah," just wanted to reach out and say, "I saw the news. Langston Conservatory. Quite the achievement. Appreciate it. The foundation has been discussing a possible artist-in-residence position. It's unpaid, of course, but it could be a good way to keep your ties with the building. Maybe do some lunchtime performances for the executives." Elijah didn't answer right away. "Peterson," he said finally, "I'm not your mascot." The line went silent. "I worked there for years. You never once asked if I played. But now you want me to entertain people while they eat soup. I'm not bitter. I'm just not there anymore." And with that, he hung up. The night of the performance arrived with a sky full of clouds and a street full of headlights. The conservatory shimmered in the winter chill, golden lights pouring through tall arched windows. The grand steps lined with photographers and guests, wrapped in fur and confidence. Inside the concert hall, everything was pristine. Velvet curtains, mahogany floors, rows upon rows of elegantly dressed patrons murmuring politely as they took their seats. Backstage, Elijah stood alone. He wore a charcoal gray suit, crisp and tailored to his shoulders, and a black tie that sat just beneath his chin like a final, quiet signature. He looked into the mirror, at the silver hair, the deep lines around his mouth, the calm in his eyes. He did not look like the man from the video. He looked like the man who should have always been on that stage. The stage manager whispered, "You're on in 30 seconds." Elijah nodded, and just before he stepped into the lights, He heard it. Uncle Eli. He turned. Darnell stood near the front row, his two sons beside him. One in a tiny blazer, the other already waving both hands like a cheerleader. Elijah's mouth twitched into a smile. He stepped out. The applause was light at first. Polite. A few people curious to see what the hype was about. He sat at the Steinway. He didn't introduce himself. Didn't look at the crowd. He just played. And by the third note they understood. This wasn't a gimmick. This wasn't a moment of charity or tokenism or spectacle. This was genius. Raw. Earned. Unapologetic. And by the final chord the entire room had risen. Not for a janitor, but for a master. The hall remained hushed for a moment after the final note faded, so long that it felt like the silence itself was paying its respects. Then, as if the spell had finally broken, the audience surged to its feet in a standing ovation that shook the velvet balconies. Elijah didn't move right away. He sat still on the piano bench, his hands resting in his lap. Not because he was stunned, but because he was absorbing it, letting it settle. This time, the applause was not an interruption. It was recognition. In the front row, Darnell stood tall, his boys jumping beside him, clapping like their hands might burst. Behind them, artists, critics, socialites, and strangers all joined in. Their faces moved, some smiling, others emotional, some simply overwhelmed. Elijah stood slowly and gave a single bow. It wasn't theatrical. It was a gesture of humility, of completion, of peace. As he turned to step away from the spotlight, someone called out, "Mr. Cole?" He turned. A woman stood near the side of the stage, walking slowly toward him. She was elderly, regal in posture, and wore a long velvet coat draped over a sequin dress. Her gray locks were pinned in a twist, and her cane tapped rhythmically as she walked. The room parted for her. "Elijah Cole," she repeated with a warm, crackling voice. "You probably don't remember me." He narrowed his eyes. She stopped just in front of the piano, looking up at him. "I taught music theory at River Hill High School. You came in one day, barely 13, sat at the back of my room and played Bach by ear." He gasped softly. "MS. Dandridge." She smiled. "You dropped out the next year," she said gently, "to help your family. But I never forgot that sound." He laughed quietly, humbled and stunned. She looked around the hall, then back to him. "You made it back," she whispered, "and not a moment too late." Later that night, after the crowd had thinned and the lights had dimmed, Elijah stood in the dressing room. He was buttoning his coat when someone knocked. It was Dr. Ellison, the conservatory's artistic director. "Elijah," she said, holding a folder, "you gave us more than a performance tonight. You gave us perspective." He nodded silently. She handed him the folder. "Inside is a formal offer. We'd like you to teach. Not theory, not yet. Not lectures. But feel, technique, expression. We want you to guide a new class of students who need what you have." He opened the folder. A salary, a schedule, benefits, but more than that, a place. "A job?" he said softly. "A calling," she replied. The next morning, Elijah sat at his kitchen table again. Sun pouring through the curtain, fingers wrapped around a steaming mug. The suit hung by the door. The shoes were back in the box. But his heart was playing. He didn't feel like a janitor. He didn't feel like a guest. He felt like a man who had finally been allowed to return to the truth he never should have had to leave. And across the table, his nephew, only 8 years old, eager-eyed and holding a pencil, asked, "Uncle Eli, will you teach me how to play?" Elijah grinned. "Boy, he said, pulling the chair beside him. I've been waiting years for someone to ask me that.